Hi, I'm Dr. Jim Carlson, and this is my lecture on the introduction to Paul in the New Testament. Paul is a major figure in the New Testament because he wrote some of the letters that we have in the New Testament. He also is credited with having much of his thought represented in other letters, or at least those other letters being associated with him. The ones that we are pretty sure Paul wrote are Philippians, Philemon. So there is some question about Ephesians. I don't think he actually wrote those. And 1st and 2nd Corinthians, among others. Others have less of a following as far as people who think Paul actually wrote those letters. But the ones I just mentioned, those are all widely considered to be written by Paul. There is discussion about Ephesians and Colossians, and I think most scholars think that those were written by somebody else. We're going to go through a little bit on Paul's life, and what I want you to do is take a look at the presentation that I've got there. It's called Introduction to Paul, and what we see in the New Testament is two different portraits of Paul. You find one portrait of Paul in the book of Acts, and in that particular picture, the image that we get in Acts, Paul is very widely accepted by the 12 disciples, become apostles in Jerusalem. Paul is not one of them. Paul comes to Christianity on his own through an encounter that he says he had with Jesus himself. Now, you will find that encounter in the book of Acts, but Paul talks about that encounter a little bit differently. And when he is done having that encounter, he comes to the conclusion that God is calling him to go, unlike the apostles in Jerusalem, to the Gentiles, to other countries. And that's what Paul does. Paul travels through Greece and Yugoslavia and other places, Syria, and he begins starting churches, and even goes up to Turkey, and he starts churches. And then what happens is that he will start a church and then train everybody how to run the church, and then he will go somewhere else and start another church. And often Paul will write back to that church to give them further instruction, or he will have received a message from somebody at that church and he will write back to them. Sometimes when Paul writes, he is very angry because something has happened. And I think there's plenty of evidence in the New Testament that there is some difference of opinion and difference of approach between Paul's approach to the Christian faith and the approach that was commended by the disciples or the apostles in Jerusalem. So let me give you kind of an illustration of the difference between Paul. Take a look at the first slide that I have there, slide number 2. We see Paul's self-portrait. He says that after he converted, he did not confer with flesh and blood. In other words, he didn't talk to anybody else about Christianity. He had some kind of experience with God, and he comes away with his own understanding of Christianity. In fact, he says, and you'll find this in Galatians 1 and 2, he went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards he returned to Damascus in Syria. So he was gone for a long time, and then he returns to Damascus. Now, 3 years later, after his encounter with Jesus, he says that he did go up to Jerusalem, and the only people that he visited were Peter for 2 weeks, and James. By this point, James, who is the brother of Jesus, is in charge. He seems to be even a higher level of authority than Peter himself. After he meets with them briefly and did not talk to anybody but James and Peter, Paul says that he went back to Syria and Cilicia, and that none of the people in Jerusalem knew who he was. Then 14 years later, after all of that, and that's a long time, he goes up again to Jerusalem, and he meets only in a private meeting with acknowledged leaders of the church in Jerusalem. And the only thing that they asked him, as long as they were willing to support his ministry, was that he collect an offering from the different churches that he started, and that he use that offering to help the poor in Jerusalem. And Paul said he was happy to do so. There is a time when he is doing ministry in Galatia and Macedonia and Greece, and he does collect that offering that they were talking about from the churches that Paul starts. After that, he comes back to Jerusalem and presents that offering to the apostles in Jerusalem, to that church. Now that's Paul's portrait of himself and his relationship with the apostles in Jerusalem. If you take a look at Luke, you will find on the next slide, slide number 3, that Luke gives a very different image of Paul. If you take a look on the left and the right side, you see that in Acts 9, Paul stays around for several days and learns about the Christian faith from a couple of folks. And as soon as he does that, he goes to local synagogues and he begins preaching and teaching about Jesus and trying to convert people to Christianity, especially those who had been Jews. That's why he goes into the synagogue. He wants them to convert from Judaism to Christianity, and Paul clearly thinks that God has intended for Christians to understand themselves as the new stage in Judaism. Then he makes a trip to Jerusalem in Acts 9, and everybody saw him, and he spoke boldly, and everybody came to know him. But people were a little afraid of him because they realized that back in the day, when Paul was a Pharisee trying to enforce the laws of Moses in the Old Testament, that Paul would arrest Christians and put them in jail because he considered them to be heretics. But he is brought back to the group by a companion named Barnabas. And Barnabas, who is not one of the 12 apostles, Barnabas is a friend with whom he does ministry, with whom he travels. And Barnabas brings him back to the apostles in Jerusalem and says, hey, this guy's okay. You don't have to worry about it. He is now a believer in Christ. He is one of us. Luke mentions a second trip to Jerusalem. Paul does not mention a second trip to Jerusalem, but Luke does. And Luke has in total 5 trips to Jerusalem, which implies a close relationship between Paul and the church in Jerusalem. Then there is a third trip to Jerusalem, which Paul also talks about. And in that third trip to Jerusalem, there is a big council with the apostles in Jerusalem, and they talk about how they want Paul to carry out his ministry in order to get their blessing. And Paul seems to have no problem with what they're saying, and Jesus' brother James kind of has the final say. They ask him to just have people follow a few laws, and then he's welcome to come out. He's welcome to go to wherever he wants and start churches with their blessing. Now, in Luke, there is 3 missionary journeys. The first one we've already talked about. The second one is now. He goes to Macedonia and Galatia. Those are Yugoslavia and Turkey, or Greece and Turkey. And he goes to what they called Asia, or Asia Minor. In Luke, in the book of Acts, there's a 4th trip to Jerusalem, and he greets the church. In Paul's own narrative of his life, he does not say anything about this visit. In fact, that 4th visit is connected to Paul's 3rd missionary journey in Acts. So after that, he returns to Jerusalem to present the offering, and this is the 5th visit to Jerusalem. So it sounds in the book of Acts as though Paul and the rest of the apostles had a very strong relationship, an affirmative relationship, and that they were cooperative. But in Paul's own writings, it seems that their relationship was more complicated and probably a little bit more conflicted. Let's talk for a second about Paul's experience of Jesus. This is on slide number 5. As you look in Acts chapter 9, Paul is traveling to Damascus, Syria, in order to try to arrest some people. This is before he is converted to Christianity. And he sees some kind of vision on the road, falls off of his horse, and is blinded by this light that he sees. And he says that in this light, he also hears Jesus speaking to him. So they took Paul, who they called Saul in Acts, and they took him to a particular home, and he was taken care of by a guy named Ananias, and then he was taught by a couple of other folks about the faith. Now, this is what he says about that particular incident in his own words. He says he considers himself the last one to whom Jesus appeared, but he also believes that since he has seen the resurrected Jesus, and it was probably a vision of Jesus in heaven, that he is just as equal in authority as the apostles in Jerusalem, even if they did not acknowledge that. Now, Paul has some very very controversial views on sexuality in his letters, and we want to take a quick look at those. One of the topics for a great deal of discussion, especially these days, is what Paul had to say about homosexuality. If you look at Romans 1, there seems to be some talk about, and this is the quote, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for each other. Those are men. Now, the debate centers on whether or not that is a reference to just sexual orientation of men who were gay and had relationships because of that, or people who were involved in some kind of temple worship, which often did involve sexual acts as part of the religious ritual. So you'll see a few verses on slide 6, which seem to indicate that Paul is against whatever it is that is, whether it's homosexuality or that kind of temple cult, and he condemns that kind of action, whatever it is that he is seeing. There is not a great deal of agreement about what he's actually referring to. In 1 Corinthians 5 and 6, Paul mentions a man who is living with his father's wife, whether this is a mother-in-law or a mother. Let's hope it's the mother-in-law, but Paul finds that somebody's doing that, and Paul calls them out on their immorality and their sin. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul also makes sure people know that they are not supposed to hire a prostitute for their own pleasure. And in fact, he says that anybody who has relations with a prostitute also connects that prostitute through their body to the church itself, because Paul has this very particular view of the church as one body made up of many different people. You can read about that, especially in 1 Corinthians 12. Now, Paul talks about what he understands to be his mission in another book, and I forgot to mention that this is one of the most important books that Paul read. That's the book of Romans. He is trying to deal with the question of how it is that Israel went from being God's chosen people to now God sending messengers out like himself to proclaim Christianity on God's behalf. And this is what he says in Romans 11. What then? Has Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking? In other words, righteousness. But the elect, obtained it, but the rest were hardened. And Paul is basically saying that a very few people, probably Jesus' apostles themselves, were able to find the kind of righteousness that other Jewish people who practiced Judaism didn't seem to be able to find. And he says that their hearts were hardened. That sounds almost as if God is trying to hide the truth from them, although it's not really clear how that works. The Bible has a few passages where it sounds that way, but it's generally not understood as Paul or God deceiving anybody. So this is how he understands the relationship between Christians and Jews and Gentiles. He says the hardening has come upon the part of Israel until the full number of Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved. His way of looking at it is to say that since Israel, in other words, the Jewish people, did not accept God or did not follow God, there hadn't been a prophet for hundreds and hundreds of years before Christ. Since that seems to be the case, that what God has done is sent Jesus to die for the sins of the world. And when the Jewish people see all of these Gentiles becoming Christians as a result of Christian preaching, they will be jealous of the fact that God seems to have moved on from them to the Christians, and their reaction to that will be to say, "Wait, we missed the boat, and we need to listen to this message that Paul is bringing us about Jesus being the Savior of the world." Take a look at the discussion questions. If you'd like to think about what is being said about Paul, take a look at the activities. You could pick a historical character whose life has more than one way of being described, not somebody in the Bible necessarily, but somebody who seems to have two different sides to their personality or their life story. You could write a description of either one of them, of either side or both sides, and see if you can have an equal treatment of both sides. Another thing you could do is to write a script about the conversation between Peter in Galatians 1 and 2 and Paul. Paul seems to really go off on Peter after Peter finds that he doesn't want to eat with the Gentiles, especially when some other people from Jerusalem come in. Paul was incensed about that and thought that Peter was being a hypocrite and calls him that to his face in Galatians. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. It's jmcarlso@carollu.edu. Thanks for watching.